Okay, so this is in the part 2 PowerPoint for respiratory. And so part 3 and 4, control of breathing, gas transport, and acid-base balance are all tied together. And then spirometry, volumes, and disease will be that last part. All right, before we go any further, we said the reason we breathe is for cellular respiration. Each cell has to go through the process of cellular respiration to make ATP. Not all tissues need as much ATP as others. So metabolizing tissues are going to do more cellular respiration, so go through more glycolysis, more Krebs cycle, more electron transport chain, more making ATP. Therefore, they're going to generate more waste products. They're going to make more carbon dioxide. They are going to generate more water metabolism, which we're totally fine with. They're going to generate more heat. And we said, though, when we go through this process, that making of carbon dioxide and water is going to form carbonic acid. Those tissues, of course, to keep doing this, they're going to need more oxygen. And of course, they're going to need some nutrients to fuel these reactions. Respiration, the rate and the depth are going to be controlled based on tissue needs. Oxygen needs, but I'm going to spoil the whole story for you. It's going to be more about getting rid of carbon dioxide than getting oxygen. I know. Just because hemoglobin's awesome. Since we were talking about control, rhythmic, it's involuntary, right? But then we have overrides, so we can also have control. And yep, we're going to say 12 to 20 breaths per minute. 12 to 20 breaths per minute. For anything, if we're going to control something, like all things with the nervous system, there's always going to be sensory input. The integration is going to be in the respiratory centers, which are going to be in the medulla and the pons. And then motor output is going to be to those respiratory muscles. Okay, and so we can change the rate and depth of breathing. As far as that input, I think I'm going to do it with a picture, but we have mechanical and chemoreceptors. Like I said, that integration of information is what's going to send that motor output and control our rate and depth of breathing. All right, I like a picture. I think I gave it to you where it's somewhere, or there's a table. All right. So there's a lot of things that go into the respiratory center that determine our rate and depth of breathing. Like I said, we have, like, you're not thinking about it right now, right? Like, like I have to breathe in. Like, you have to kind of dial in and have conscious breathing, right? But we all know that we can hold our breath, and I'm controlling my rate and depth of breathing while I'm speaking. Okay, so there's a lot to it. So there are higher brain centers, so we do have voluntary control. Also, sometimes, if you get emotional or you get excited, you're going to have an elevated rate and depth of breathing. If you're bored to death, everything's going to slow down and you'll have a decreased rate and depth of breathing. So your emotions also come into play. When we talk about just the needs of gases, so getting in oxygen and getting rid of carbon dioxide, it's going to be monitored. Okay, so we have peripheral chemoreceptors, and they're really close to where the blood pressure receptors are. Only we're going to say we have aortic bodies, okay, and carotid bodies. So right there, same places as the baroreceptors, just a different group of cells. And these are going to be responding to chemicals in the blood, so they're chemoreceptors. And the peripheral chemoreceptors, they are going to be responding to decreased oxygen, right? Because we need oxygen to ATP increase carbon dioxide, and we know that whenever there's more carbon dioxide, we have an increase in acid. Okay, so if oxygen goes down, carbon dioxide goes up, and acid goes up, that's going to stimulate the respiratory center to increase rate and depth of breathing. We also have central chemoreceptors right there, right by the respiratory center. So in the central nervous system, our brain is very sensitive to changes in pH. Okay, inside the in the cerebrospinal fluid, we lose our blood buffer. Okay, so there's going to be more shifts in the brain. So the central chemoreceptors have more weight or input to the respiratory center. And so they're going to respond to an increase in carbon dioxide. And we said carbon dioxide and water, we are going to get hydrogen ions and acid. So that would cue or stimulate an increased rate and depth of breathing. Also, we have proprioception. So when you start moving, you start running, that's a cue going, hey, we're muscles, we're moving. So we are going to need more oxygen because we need to make more ATP to fuel our movement. Okay, so all of those are going to be very stimulatory. Things that will decrease rate and depth of breathing, we actually have stretch receptors in our lungs. And if we take a really big breath in, I think this is why deep breathing, if somebody wants to calm their nervous system, right, and cue parasympathetic innervation, taking a nice deep slow breath can do that. It is going to impact the respiratory centers. Okay, also just says slow everything down. Okay. 2, if there's an irritant, so let's say the air is noxious, smoke, whatever, that too, the respiratory system is going, we don't want to breathe that. Down, 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 regulate that. This is a close-up of the respiratory centers. So we are in the brainstem. And so remember this bumpy part, so it goes midbrain, pons, medulla. These little purple things, they're just showing you nuclei. So they are groups of neurons that are going to work together for a particular function. Okay? The one that really sets and sends that motor output to our respiratory muscles, so to the diaphragm by the phrenic nerve, or to those intercostals, that is going to be from the ventral respiratory control group. But there's lots of information that goes in, so the ventral respiratory control group will initiate that breathing, but they sort of are communicating with the other respiratory groups. If you kind of watch our little arrows here, this dorsal respiratory group, it is receiving the proprioception information, like, oh, are we moving, and the other information, and it is going to communicate with that ventral group. But you can kind of see the motor output comes from that ventral respiratory group. The pons is responsible for making that transition between inspiration and expiration smooth. They know this, they figured this out when people had damage to their pons, they would still breathe. Their medulla, the respiratory center, is working, but they don't breathe smoothly. So sort of like a ragged breath, you know, like your breathing is seamless, it's smooth, that requires coordination and transition. And so they know that the pontine respiratory group, it's interacting, but you can live without it. Okay, so the actual stimulus to breathe is going to be from that ventral respiratory group. So like I said, there's peripheral receptors, so right here in the aortic bodies, in the aortic arch, and then right there at that bifurcation, so we have our common carotids, internal and external, that is where the carotid bodies are. And so there's an O in it, so they're going to be monitoring oxygen and other respiratory gases. So peripheral chemoreceptors, they're sensitive to oxygen, but in all honesty, not very, because you have to lose a lot of oxygen, so to be about 50% before that is the driving factor. Like I said, our number one stimulus is going to be the increase in carbon dioxide that we have to get rid of. The central chemoreceptors are going to be in the medulla, and we have a blood-brain barrier, and then we have cerebrospinal fluid, right? And that's what's actually bathing the brain. And carbon dioxide freely diffuses across that blood-brain barrier, and there's carbonic anhydrase here on the brain side, okay, so in between the dura, and so we get that bicarbonate, and then we also get that hydrogen ion. There's no hemoglobin to buffer that. There's no blood buffer system here, right, because we left blood out here, and so the brain is going to be very sensitive to this decrease in pH. Okay, so the central chemoreceptors are going to have a very strong signal to the respiratory center, and if they detect that there is high CO2, meaning the pH is dropping, they're going to have the strongest influence in controlling rate and depth of breathing. Like I said, I hate to blow your world, you're not really breathing to get oxygen. I mean, you are, but you're more breathing to get rid of the carbon dioxide and maintain a stable pH. This is all the things I said, only in word form. I knew it was somewhere in here. Okay, how's that? When we talk about gas exchange, we have to do just a little bit just to kind of understand the air that we breathe. And we said that atmospheric pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. This pressure comes from all of the gases in our atmosphere. And so that's called Dalton's law of partial pressures. So we have, and I'm a rounder, I think your notes, I put 20%, 80%, but sure. 14% of the air is going to be oxygen, 75% is nitrogen, and collectively you put the pressures together, they come up with the majority of our atmospheric pressure. Okay, we also have some mixed gases, we have a little bit of carbon dioxide. And so they are going to behave, each one will move independently, always from greater pressure to lesser pressure. We just looked at the partial pressures is going to be a collection of all the gases in our atmospheric air. And when we breathe, like I said, we're kind of working with this 760. Okay, all we have to do is drop it 1 millimeter of mercury, we inspire, we have to raise our pressure 1 above, so 761, we can expire. Now we're going to talk about gases moving inside the body, and so each of these gases moves independently. All right, so what does this mean? So gases are going to diffuse across cell membranes. They can do that. And like I said, they're going to do it based on their pressures, and they always move high pressure to low pressure. And it doesn't require any energy at all. The thing is, we have this, and you kind of maybe you're thinking, going like, okay, we have a whole lot of nitrogen. Why does this not really come into play? Like, because I'm just going to talk about oxygen and carbon dioxide. Nitrogen itself is not very soluble. Okay, so it doesn't really enter into our bloodstream. Carbon dioxide is the most soluble, but we don't really have a whole lot of carbon dioxide, and we're the ones generating it. And then oxygen isn't very soluble, but we have hemoglobin, which is awesome. Okay, so hemoglobin's going to do the carrying for us. And gases are less soluble at higher temperatures. And so that was, we watched in the video too, when temperatures are high, it is more difficult to breathe just because you don't get that little increase in volume because gases expand. It's hot to hot, so hot from the air, hot into the lungs, you don't get that little bump. But then also the solubility, we need oxygen to go into the bloodstream. So we need it to become soluble. And I don't know if you're an athlete, if you run, your time is way different if you run on a nice cool day than if you run in August. Okay, they know this from marathon times as well. So gases are always also subject to differences in temperature is how well we can breathe or how well we get that gas exchange. All right, so pulmonary ventilation, we get air to the alveoli. That magical place, the respiratory zone, we have our respiratory membrane just 2 cells thick. Okay, we have the cell wall of the alveolus, we have a shared basement membrane, and then we have the wall of the pulmonary capillaries. So external respiration, we get oxygen will diffuse from greater pressure to lesser pressure, so from the air spaces in the air sacs to the blood, and carbon dioxide, our waste gas, will just diffuse from the blood to the space in the alveoli. Okay, and this doesn't cost us any energy at all. Okay, so that's what external respiration is. I put many slides because if you know your different respiratory events, that means you kind of understood the respiratory system. So I put the money slides there, meaning don't miss those. This exchange, so this external respiration happens in the alveoli, and there's two parts to this, right? We've got the air getting to the alveoli, so that's called ventilation, right, breathing. And then we have perfusion. What was perfusion? Anyone remember?
That's the air distributing to the organs.
That's the blood distributing to the organs, yes. And so we have our pulmonary capillaries. And there's ventilation, perfusion, coupling. When someone is in a state of health, those two things are matched. Okay, meaning we've got air in these spaces and we have blood flow. Okay, and that's what you want in a state of health. You want those two things to match up because we need that external respiration to occur. In a state of disease, that means there's going to be a misbalance there. The ventilation is going to be controlled through the airways. So the airways have smooth muscle. They can dilate and open nice and big, right? So we get a lot of air going to those lower airways. So sympathetic nervous system. Or we can get bronchoconstriction, right? So the bronchioles can constrict and allow less air to get to those air spaces. So that's ventilation. Perfusion, we know that there are sphincters going to capillary beds. So we can open up those sphincters and we can get perfusion, so vasodilation, or we can get constriction and have less blood go to the alveoli. And so this is going to be all auto-regulated. When it gets mismatched, that's usually because of disease. So we talked about pulmonary embolism, so that would be a block in the pulmonary circuit. So if there's no perfusion, we've got blood, no blood there, but we have air there. And that really doesn't serve the purpose of the respiratory system. Okay, other things, a collapsed lung, you would have blood flow, but you wouldn't have any airflow. Okay, so in a state of health, ventilation, perfusion is coupled. I think your book talks about altitude sickness. So exposure to high altitudes, when somebody goes to a higher elevation, the atmospheric pressure drops. Okay, and if someone's unaccustomed to that and they haven't acclimated to that, then they've got blood flow, but they don't have the air, right? Because they're not getting as much oxygen. And so we have reduced oxygen availability and inspired air affecting ventilation. So consequence, despite adequate perfusion, there's that mismatch that can lead to hypoxemia, so hypo, low oxygen in the blood, and that's where you get altitude sickness. So they just chose that as an example to kind of show you that mismatch. You got blood flow, good, you don't have enough air, you don't have enough oxygen there. Okay, so now we've got oxygen in the bloodstream, and so now we have to go to the tissues. So we had pulmonary ventilation, just breathing, external respiration, we've got oxygen into the bloodstream, and now the blood is going to be carried by the cardiovascular system to each of our cells, right? So the tissue cells, they're busy making carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide will be higher pressure in the cells and in the interstitial fluid than in the blood, so carbon dioxide just diffuses. And then we had loaded oxygenated blood because it was just of the lungs, so oxygen will detach from hemoglobin and diffuse to the tissues. And so that's called internal respiration because you're inside the body, so you're at the tissues. Big picture recap. Yep, money slide. So this movement of air into those air spaces, alveoli, that's just ventilation, pulmonary ventilation. Then we have external respiration, and this is going to be based on just partial pressures. The pressure of oxygen is higher in the air spaces, so oxygen diffuses into the blood, and we get that color change. There's more carbon dioxide that was brought back, right, from that right side of the heart. That's deoxygenated blood, so carbon dioxide will just diffuse from the blood into the alveoli. We get rid of it. So external respiration, then it's the job of the cardiovascular system, so that left side of the heart, then takes the oxygenated blood to the tissues, and then this is going to be the site of our external respiration. Oxygen just diffuses based on partial pressure. You can see oxygen is higher. And so oxygen unloads, and then there's more carbon dioxide in the tissues. So carbon dioxide will diffuse from the tissues into the blood, and then that venous return is going to return it to the right side of the heart, and then it goes through the pulmonary circuit and picks up oxygen. The whole thing happens again. Yep, there it is for you, just showing the differences in pressure. And like I said, things are going to be moving based on their pressures, higher pressure to lower pressure. All right, so the next part is just, now that we know that it exchanges, how is it actually being transported in the blood? And this is a recap slide. I'm going to do it with pictures, but this is your take-home message. Yep, amazing hemoglobin molecule. I wish I had a t-shirt with just hemoglobin on it. Hemoglobin allows us to live in an atmosphere of 14% oxygen, even though it's not soluble in blood. And so hemoglobin molecule, we've got 4 polypeptide chains. We have that heme group with iron. Hemoglobin reversibly binds oxygen. That's what makes it so awesome. And so it's going to pick up oxygen in the lungs, and then it's going to let it go in the tissues. When it is holding oxygen, it's called oxyhemoglobin. When it lets it go, it's called deoxyhemoglobin. And one hemoglobin molecule can carry 4 oxygen molecules. And so each of those heme groups, that iron can hold on to hemoglobin. So yeah, so think of hemoglobin just like a delivery truck. And red blood cells are stuffed full of hemoglobin. This isn't magic though, it's just chemistry. It's not like it knows we want it to pick up oxygen, that it knows we want it to drop it off. And so the conditions in the lung optimize that loading of hemoglobin. There is higher oxygen in the lungs. It is a higher pH than in the tissues because lung tissue isn't really, it's just kind of stretching. It's not doing a whole lot. And then the temperatures are cooler than body temperature. And so these curves are showing you that at a higher pH, hemoglobin is more saturated than at a lower pH. And it's also showing you at a cooler temperature, hemoglobin is more saturated. So it's just chemistry. The oxygen loads on in the lungs. Conditions are perfect for that. So we get oxygen pickup in the lungs, so during that external respiration. And then it's transported by the cardiovascular system. And then in the tissues, we have a different environment, right? Those tissues are making carbon dioxide, so that's gone up. They've generated acid, so pH is down, and then the temperature is warmer. So now we're on this side of the curve, and notice hemoglobin is not as saturated with oxygen, and so oxygen unloads. Like I said, it's not magic, it's just the perfect conditions for what we need. And then too much oxygen is still bound to hemoglobin even in venous blood, and that's why you can hold your breath and you don't die. Okay, you still have oxygen. So it's not like, okay, we cleared out the truck. It's all empty. It's never empty unless you're dead. Since this is just chemistry, there are other gases that have an affinity for hemoglobin as well. And that's why carbon monoxide is poisonous to us, because it too has an affinity for the iron molecules that we use to bind oxygen. And so carbon monoxide will bind there, but it doesn't let go. Like I said, oxygen, we've got these nice conditions set up, and we got pickup in the lungs and drop off in the tissues, but the carbon monoxide will stay right there. So treatment for carbon monoxide poisoning, we basically have to force the carbon monoxide off, and so the treatment would be in the hyperbaric oxygen chamber. We have to force carbon monoxide off. So we haven't really talked about how does carbon dioxide get transported. Carbon dioxide, some of it is going to be just dissolved in the plasma, and not very much of it, like roughly 7%. Some of it can be attached to the proteins, so the protein part of hemoglobin, so carbaminohemoglobin is what it's called, but the majority of it is going to go through this reaction. Okay, we know that carbon dioxide with water will form carbonic acid, and then it's going to dissociate into this bicarbonate and that hydrogen ion. So when I ask you in a week or two, how does the majority of carbon dioxide travel, you're going to say as that bicarbonate ion. So what this sets up is our carbonic acid blood buffer. And buffers are usually made up of a weak acid and a weak base pair. So this is where we get into controlling of our rate and depth of breathing as it relates to pH. Okay, so not to oxygen. And the respiratory system is very powerful in adjusting short-term pH, right, just by controlling breathing. So if I hold my breath, okay, that means I'm not blowing off oxygen. If I hold my breath, it drives the reaction this way, right? Because I'm not blowing it off. So I'm accumulating carbon dioxide, I'm accumulating carbonic acid, and so high CO2 is going to cause a drop in pH. Because this is an equilibrium. If I blow off a lot of CO2, just think of a little acid breather, then I can get rid of acid and raise pH. Think of it like a seesaw. We are going to use this bicarbonate that we generate to help buffer our blood. And so there's something that has to occur. It's called the chloride shift. So we know that carbonic anhydrase is going to make carbonic acid, and then it's going to dissociate into a hydrogen ion, which is in essence acid, because that's what pH is measuring, and this bicarbonate, which is actually a base. So this little neat trick that we're going to do is the red blood cells are going to kick out the bicarbonate, and bring in chloride because we can't be electrically imbalanced. And then this hydrogen ion, a lot of it is going to be attached to hemoglobin, that protein molecule itself can serve as a blood buffer. And so we get electric balance, and we're buffering the acids that we make in our bloodstream. Yep, just remember that. I'll be connecting this for the next, till we have our exam. So this is a first pass, because I see some of your eyes going, it's chemistry and it's pH. If you can remember this picture, and we're gonna watch a little video, wherever your breath goes, acid leaves, okay? So if you're blowing out, acid is leaving the body, okay? And that is why we breathe more when we're doing more, okay? So metabolizing tissues make carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide means more hydrogen ions, meaning acidic, meaning dropping the pH. When we exhale carbon dioxide, we drive the reaction this way and get rid of that acid. So too much CO2, okay, and I'm going to give you the mnemonic, respiratory is opposite. So if CO2 is high, pH is the opposite, is low. Okay, and this is what you're going to see with respiratory disease. Okay, if somebody can't breathe, they can't blow off their CO2, and we're always making it. Okay, so respiratory is opposite. And if there's too little CO2, okay, so thumb down, then pH is going to be high. So respiratory is opposite. I'm going to add metabolic is equal next week, but let's not worry about that for now. Respiratory is opposite. All right, so I'm going to prove it to you. Well, maybe not. Oh. I'll pull that one up later. That's it. Okay. So what can happen is if there is respiratory disease, or somebody has a breathing pattern that is not controlled, you can end up with what's called respiratory acidosis or respiratory alkalosis, meaning it's a respiratory issue that is altering the pH of a person. Okay, so acidosis means the pH of the blood is below 7.35, and alkalosis, the pH is high, above 7.45. All right, so let's kind of look at this. Okay, so you look at that picture, and so if I'm hyperventilating, okay, I'm emotionally distressed, I am hyperventilating. Okay, what do you get? What's happening to my pH as I'm doing this? Yeah. Very good, raising up, right. So I have low pH, I have low carbon dioxide because I've blown it all off. Okay, so pH is going to go up. So you can get to respiratory alkalosis. All right, so hypoventilation, so now I am under breathing. Okay, so now I'm going to drive that reaction over here. So what's my pH going to be doing? It's me going down, right? So respiratory is opposite. If carbon dioxide goes up, pH goes down. And so, yeah, any of your respiratory diseases, obstructive pulmonary disease, you pick one, pneumonia, alveoli have mucus in them, so you don't get that exchange, okay? You hold your breath, whatever. pH is going to go down because carbon dioxide goes up. So those two are linked. Respiratory is opposite.